Everyone's computer. Okay. I think it's recording. Good. All right. Well, I'm very excited to introduce our speaker, Carol Righi, who many of you know. She's written a couple of books on the subject, and she serves on the editorial board of the Journal of Usability Studies, among other things. And in her day job, she's the Human-Centered Design Practice Lead at 1904 Labs in St. Louis, Missouri. So over to you, Carol.
Thank you so much. Thanks, Paul. Just before I start talking, y'all hear me okay? All good? Great. All right. So let's get started. Couple of things. Let's just do a little bit of housekeeping first, and then we'll get into the meat of this. So again, thank you to TorCHI and to all of you, Paul, and many of you I know, which is really great to see you again, for inviting me today. I just I'll introduce what we're going to talk about in just a minute. As Paul said, we're going to be recording this, so I just wanted to make sure everybody was aware of that. And, you know, everybody's so Zoom smart these days, so we're going to use our typical Zoom conventions. Go ahead and make sure you're muted by default. Share your video, please. As Alona said, it's really nice to see everybody's faces. And then we're going to use the chat to ask questions, comment, raise your hand. If you can keep a running list of questions there. I'm going to get through this presentation and then take questions and comments afterwards instead of stopping along the way. So if you have a question or a comment, you could just throw it into chat and then we'll review them later on. And if you could avoid side discussions so that we can all talk at once, so talk together, that would be a lot better. So with that, let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. We're talking about process and user-centered design, and I'll give you a little bit of history, a little walk down memory lane in a minute. But before we do, I want to push out a quick poll to you guys. I skipped ahead here. Very sensitive mouse. A couple of questions with regard to process and the integration of human-centered design or user-centered design or UX, any of the above, with development. So with regard to creating superior digital products, how important is it that it's integrated? And in your personal experience, how likely is it that it's integrated? So let me go ahead and push this poll and just take a second and respond, and then I'll share the results. Just another 30 seconds. Okay, I don't think we need the whole 30 seconds. It looks like everybody's responses are completed. So I am going to share these results. Paul, I think I just hit end poll to share the results. Is that correct?
Yeah, I believe so.
Yep, there we go. All right, so we got a little bit of a bimodal distribution on the first one. There's a couple of very unimportant, but it looks like the greatest number by far is important or very important with regard to integrating HCD or UCD with development. And then in terms of experience, how likely has it been for you all? And that is, wow, that is a real normal distribution there, anywhere from very unlikely, 9 below the mean, which is the 11 as a 3, and then just a couple actually, about 5 saying likely or very likely. So that's kind of what I was expecting, that I think we believe that it's important that it's integrated, but in our experience, it really hasn't been uniformly or frequently or consistently. So thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. And as I said, today's topic is a process, and I want to take you through my experience with the process of UCD and HCD since I began in this field. Um, I began working in this field at a really exciting time, and it's where I actually met many of you. Throughout the 1980s, personal computers revolutionized IT. You all know this stuff because the focus moved from building tools for the trained computer scientists and the like to building tools for the average user, the consumer, the customer, the end user. So this time period saw a real focus on what we called usability. That was everybody's title: usability engineer, usability manager. And the goal was making complicated things easy. And so in my early experience at IBM, where I started working in 1992, the model for usability professionals, from my experience, was largely as fractional researchers acting as shared resources to multiple development teams. So the folks on my team typically served anywhere from 3, 4, but sometimes 6, 7, 8 different product teams, and they were slicing their time among all these teams. And the major activity that we were doing initially was usability testing. And we were always called late downstream, right? The product was already built. We were called at the end right before it was going to be launched or delivered, just to find showstoppers and big issues. And then we would write this nice report and hand it over and use our skills of persuasion to convince developers to make changes to the design. And usually it was too late to do anything about it, but we gave it the old college try. But we knew this was not ideal. I mean, the research told us what we knew instinctively and what a lot of people in the field were saying. We could be far more effective if we move upstream in the process, right? To get the design right in the first place and not just come in and test at the end. So to move from usability to something we called user-centered design, right? So it had more of an emphasis on design, and it wasn't just that back-end usability. And we want to engage user-centered design in product decisions and not just do testing after those decisions were made, usually by developers in the business. So all across the industry, IBM joined other companies because everybody was thinking along the same lines. Companies like Sun, and remember them, and Digital, and remember them, and Microsoft and Apple, advocating for an integrated process where user-centered design was part of development rather than an add-on. And IBM, that effort actually emanated from Toronto, from the Toronto lab. So kudos to y'all. Under the leadership of Carl Vredenberg, who was mentioned earlier, and the Toronto UCD team. And we held a lot of cross-company workshops and the different labs like Austin and Boca Raton, which is where I was, Raleigh, Cary, San Jose, others. We really worked together to define and educate and evangelize for a user-centered design process rather than just kind of one-off activities. And a group out of the training division at the same time created a curriculum and rolled it out worldwide. So then the next period for me was marked by a long period of working as an independent consultant, and more efforts by the industry at the same time were happening to move UCD upstream. And throughout this time, I remember every single conference, every published paper, every one of these kinds of meetings seemed to all be pointing to the same goal, right? We always said we want a seat at the table. We want to be upstream. We want to increase our influence upstream. And that's around the time that Carl and Scott Eisensee and myself wrote our book on user-centered design and integrated approach. And it was quite literally years in the making. I think when we started, there were maybe 2 kids among us. And then by the time we were done, we were up to maybe 6 or 7. I think most of that was attributed to Carl, but I did my part as well. But then also at this time, the .com space was booming, right? I remember attending, some of you might have attended as well, the 2000 UPA conference. And attendance was unexpectedly off the charts. It was like a factor of 10 bigger than the year before. Many people in companies who were like tech writers and business analysts, developers, were voluntold, you're going to be the new user-centered design person. So go learn how to do that thing and come back, and then you're that person for our company. You know, that was happening. And also what was happening was people who were user-centered designers, dyed in the wool, were actually getting positions higher up in the food chain at organizations. As you know, .com really made it crystal clear that ignoring users is done at your peril, right? At the peril of sales and conversions and customer sat and all the things that we learned to measure, NPS and all that kind of stuff. Because it became so important to serve the customer. Also at this time, IA, information architecture as a specialty, arose because of websites and became so prevalent that there was a big debate. You know, we have lots of big debates about what we call ourselves. At that time, the debate was maybe we all call ourselves IAs, right? And of course, we had those little tempests and teapots debating our name. And it's nice that what we call ourselves as a debate is still alive and well, and I don't think it'll ever die. But anyhow, we could probably spend the rest of the hour talking about that. But anyhow, let's get back to .com boom. The jobs were plentiful as well. And UCD as a process, however, still was not, you know, we were expecting this big change because of .com, that all of a sudden UCD was going to be integrated into development. And it didn't happen. Many of us were still fighting for a seat at the table. Many of us were still shaving our time into many slivers across many different groups. Projects were standalone, they weren't integrated. So, you know, I would do a study and I would deliver the results as I used to, and just kind of hope the fruits of my labor would find their way into products somehow. But then at the same time, you know, in software development, a new movement called Agile was born. And Agile actually first hit the scene in 2001. It took a while for it to gain traction, but this is around the same time when it started. And then if you, in 2006, if you look at that year, I kind of went back personally into a software development organization, not on my own anymore. And we changed our name. So now we're user-centered design, right? And instead of usability, pretty much most of the companies that I worked with were user-centered design. And at my company, user-centered designers were actually part of the development team. However, they were still working pretty much siloed off. So we weren't usually co-located, but there was more sort of integration, more conversations with the developers. But you know, it was still not integrated in a full sense of the word. It was around this time too that Janice James and I, Janice, who was the founder of the UPA, wrote user-centered design stories. And there's a whole section in that book about how do you get a UCD into your organization? Where do you put it in the company? And what should the process be? So more attention to process. And again, ongoing desire to be more and more integrated in software development. And then finally, not finally, actually next came another stretch. This was another stretch of me working independently, keeping busy, not integrated in development teams. Again, just here's hoping the data that I created, the reports I created were being used, would be taken up into decisions. And except for a minor .com bust, you know, that minor thing that happened in there, other than that, jobs and opportunities were doing, you know, we're still pretty strong. But UCD was still pretty siloed. At the same time, Agile started to gain steam, right? So the question of how do we integrate UCD, not with waterfall anymore, but how do we integrate it with Agile? It makes a lot of sense, right? To integrate it with Agile because they're two peas in a pod, right? They're rapid, they're iterative. It would seem that those two should mesh together. Of course, the devil's in the details, as always. And this is what actually we're going to talk a lot more about this in the rest of this presentation. And then finally, in 2016, I joined a startup software development company, 1904 Labs, all the branding and stuff. The company focuses on agile development as its foundation. But what's different now for me can be attributed to several different factors. I think the most important one, though, is that the founder of the company actually previously headed up an experienced design company. It wasn't a software development company. It was experienced design. And through that, he really drank the Kool-Aid. He really understood that human-centered design, the value of including that in software development was just immeasurable, and that it should be on every product team in his perspective. So when I joined the company and I became the practice lead for HCD, he kind of locked me and this other dude in a virtual room for 3 years. And this other dude is an Agilist and has lots of certifications and lots of experience. And he said, okay, you guys figure out how to put HCD and Agile together, right? And, you know, we looked at Agile UX, and we looked at Lean, and we looked at different kinds of models, but we wanted to do something that was going to be custom to our shop and something that would work in the ways that we knew the best. So this was the best opportunity, frankly, that I ever had to influence how HCD is practiced in an organization. So, you know, because of our commitment to do this as a best practice, it was also important that sales was on board. And so we made sure that our sales folks were read in and understood the process, that marketing was on board, and talent acquisition. I mean, we wanted to make sure that we were hiring developers who wanted to work this way and who understood enough about HCD and were receptive to it, so that if they were put on a team, they knew they were going to be working hand in glove with human-centered designers in an integrated process. So it really has to go up and down the organization. And honestly, it started from the top. And that was something, you know, lamenting over the years, boy, if we only had that leadership at the very, very tippy top of all these organizations who really evangelized and advocated for UCD, it could happen, right? Because the grassroots was always on board, but the leadership had to be on board. So I kind of felt like I died and went to heaven when I joined this company, because he's really serious about this. We're still working on this today, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next little bit. How do we do it? You know, how's it working for us now? What went into building this kind of hybrid process? Its pros, its cons, and its future. So let's get into that. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about the origins of, and again, what's in a name, right? We call it HCD Agile. It's, you know, we could have called it anything really, and it's not so markedly different than some other processes like Agile UX, but we wanted to make sure that, you know, we were distinguishing this as the way we put this together. So anyhow, we started with looking at the key tenets of HCD. And again, those of you in this field know this inside out, right? Focuses on users and their tasks. We make sure that we're balancing the business, the technology, and the humans, the three-legged stool. We focus on the total user experience, everything the user sees, hears, and touches. We make sure measurement is involved all the way from the beginning to the end. There's a set of tools, techniques for both research and design, and that it's an integrated and disciplined process. So, you know, with that, those basic tenets, we looked at, you know, there are also gaps in human-centered design and practice. So there's a lot of benefits, but the implementation has shortcomings. As we said earlier, it's frequently siloed from development, so it can't be as effective as it would be normally. It can be time consuming if you're not moving quickly and you're not as lean as you need to be. It often omits user research, usually because people perceive it as time consuming, or they believe that they don't need it. You know how that goes. And also terminology can be confusing. As we mentioned earlier, people aren't quite sure what they're buying when they're buying UX versus HCD versus UCD. So in practice, HCD has some of these gaps. So we kind of kept those in mind as we started to build our hybrid process. At the same time, our Agile side of the house, you know, Agile Key Tenets, right? This is the Agile Manifesto, essentially. Individuals and interactions are more important than process and tools. Working software is pushed out. MVPs are more important than comprehensive documentation. Customer collaboration is more important than what we call contract negotiation, which covers a whole broad swath of things. And then responding to change is so critical over following a plan. So this is the manifesto that is kind of says waterfall bad, agile good, right? So again, nothing here that seems crazy, right? However, in practice, there are gaps in Agile as well, right? Lots of benefits, but the implementation often has shortcomings, right? So a lot of times Agile overemphasizes the business and IT over users. So yes, we're being very responsive, but a lot of that responsiveness comes from having long conversations with business stakeholders and building the features they want, and then doing demos of the MVP instead of gathering user feedback. There's an undervaluing of planning, right? Agile has a bias toward action, and the idea is move fast, and you know, just keep iterating. And so planning kind of goes out the window. And there is value to planning, but there's really not a lot of it if you're really biased toward action and iteration. Inadequate feedback, suboptimally gathered and poorly understood. So a lot of times developers do demos, right? They're not doing user feedback session, or they're doing it so informally in ways that really don't give them the rich kind of feedback that they need to make changes. And then finally, working software. Working is ambiguous, right? Does working mean the code works? Does it mean the design works? Does it actually solve a problem in the first place, right? That was presented. So these are the gaps of Agile. And basically what we did is we looked at the gaps at HCD, the gaps at Agile, the strengths, the weaknesses, and put them together. So the third way is really the Agile Manifesto with the addition of human-centered design over human-centeredness over technology-driven development, and validation over subjective assumptions. And a little bit more detail than that's kind of really high level. I'll give you a little bit more detail in a movie in just a second. But essentially, we always say we want to build the right thing the right way. And what does that mean? Build the right thing is the part of that human-centered design of understanding the requirements, right? And understanding what people need, understanding what the business needs, what the users need, and what the technology can enable. And that's building the right thing. And then building it the right way is doing it in an Agile HCD iterative fashion. So we try to do shorthand that. I'm going to show you a quick movie that describes our process. Please bear with it feels a little salesy at the beginning, just ignore that part, but it really does give a good overview of the steps in the process.
Carol, we don't hear the audio.
Sorry?
We don't hear the audio.
Okay, let me go back to the beginning and I'll do it. Let me do it over the, see if this works. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear it.
Yep.
Our clients are the top innovators in their field, and they're focused on solving the right problems the right way. They have critical projects that touch many areas of their company. So the cost of failure is high. It affects their employees, their customers, and their partners, with time, money, and reputation typically at stake. When there is a problem that needs to be solved, these companies call us 1904 Labs. Helping large companies solve complex problems is what we do. We use a four-step approach, our signature methodology, Human-Centered Design Agile, or HCD Agile for short. HCD Agile pairs human-centered designers and researchers with Agile technologists to form one team that works together for the entire project lifecycle. The process begins in pre-engagement, where we listen to our stakeholders and determine the composition of the team and the scope and the duration of the project. Once we reach agreement, discovery is the next step. Discovery reveals critical information vital to the success of the project. It helps head off costs and mistakes in the next project phase, delivery. It ensures it identifies the right thing for us to build and that we focus on the right problem and the right solution. Discovery happens during the first 2 to 4 sprints, typically 1 to 2 months. We start by aligning around the goals of the business and by identifying and understanding the available technologies. We then observe and interview users in their environment. We use what we have learned to create personas, each persona with their own journey map. That understanding carries through to the story map, which is the foundation for the initial product backlog and triggers the next step, laying down the product roadmap. In short, we create a shared vision with our client for the solution and lay the groundwork for building that solution. Delivery is the next phase where we bring the shared vision to life. Technologists using modern software and data solutions build out the product, while human-centered designers use prototyping, usability testing, and other techniques to explore and validate designs with the users before the technologists bring the designs to life. This tight coordination speeds up development and ensures a successful outcome for our client. The entire team follows a product roadmap, making sure that these product iterations are aligned with the goals set forth during discovery. Once the solution is delivered, we execute an orderly transition back to the client. HCD Agile, in its essence, is taking the time to build the right thing the right way. This is HCD Agile. This is 1904 Labs.
Okie doke. You hear me again? All right. So essentially, you know, a lot of the stuff is very familiar to all, I'm sure. It's really just the way that we package it and the way we roll it out. Our teams are all on board with how this goes. We have a role I'll talk about in a second. It's called the Agile Engineering Lead, and they're really like the project manager, the scrum master of this team. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The 4 phases that you saw in the video, again, pre-engagement, discovery, delivery, and transition. Pre-engagement is really important to make sure that we understand what we're going to start the project, the understanding at the initial part of the project. Discovery is really where we dig in and do those 2 to 4 sprints worth of research. And then delivery and transition, pretty clear what those are, I think. These are some of the roles on the team. As I mentioned earlier, we work from the product owner back. So we're a consulting company. We want to make sure that the product owner of our client is very involved. They're really responsible for managing the backlog, right? So the priorities is really in their hands. We want to make sure we have a good relationship with the product owner, that there's constant communication, that they're effectively part of the team. That's always, it could be very challenging when the product owner is actually matrixed across a bunch of different projects, but it's a really critical role. And the other business stakeholders, there can be other stakeholders, business sponsor on the client side. But then our team consists of, as I mentioned, the Agile engineering lead. So they're basically the Scrum Master, the coach, they're the servant leader to the team. And they have very close relationship with the client. The other key role you could see is the human-centered design lead. And these two folks are co-leads of the team. We initially, the AEL, when I joined the company, was the only lead of the team. But we really wanted to elevate human-centered design. And so we created a co-leadership situation with these two different roles. And you know, I'll tell you, it's a lot easier to have one person leading a team. It's a lot harder to have co-leads. We've taken a long time to try to define who's doing what so that the coordination is clear, so that everybody has their bailiwick. And like everything that we do is Agile, our role definitions changed over time as well. So we have regular meetings with our team of AELs and our human-centered designers, and they work together to define these roles and constantly refine these roles. And then, the core team members can really be developers. They can be full stack developers, DevOps. We have data engineers, decision scientists, and it's a typical Agile sort of size team. We try to keep the teams 5, 6, more or less in size. And then you may have some additional subject matter experts as well. So it's a typical Agile team, except for the addition of the human-centered designer as one of those leads. One of the things that happens in human-centered design, you've all seen some variation of this as well, is that we need to be ahead of the developers with regard to our research and our design. And so we do this rolling wave sort of thing. And again, the devil is in the details, coordinating the timing of these activities so that we can create designs and do the research in time for the developers to take it up and then go ahead and build it. And that's always, again, it's very tricky, but that's the role of the co-leads, especially the AEL, is to keep an eye on which sprint, what's coming up in the next sprint and what needs to be done from an HCD perspective. So again, these are basic principles. This is just the way that we're doing this. And then, you know, we can get into some of the details about how do you point stories, right? So in Agile, of course, you know, velocity is measured by how many points. And what happens with human-centered design, right? How do you point human-centered design stories? Are they, you know, are you comparing apples versus oranges? And should we be part of the velocity or should we not? So the formulation we've settled on as of now, we could probably, you know, we're evolving this methodology, is that because they're not created equal, we definitely want HCD stories in the backlog. If they're not in the backlog, they're not visible and they can be ignored. But so we either point all the stories, but we don't combine the stories when we're counting velocity. Other teams are trying things like pointing the stories on the HCD side, or actually putting 0-point stories, but keeping them in the backlog. As long as they're in the backlog, they get addressed. So different methods, you know, there are different ways, and we're trying different things as we're evolving this. But the kind of the key here is that you want the visibility, you want to be in the backlog, and that those development, those design spikes, and those research spikes really need to be visible. Also, this is a kind of a special area that we've drilled down into, HCD Agile for data projects. So how do you apply HCD Agile to projects that have no obvious user interface? So things like, we do a lot of data engineering types of projects. We do data lake development, pipeline development. There are decision science projects and so forth. And of course, my boss, being, you know, who he is and believing in human-centered design, always puts a human-centered designer on every team. And the first few data projects that we had, the human-centered designers were walking around saying, well, what am I doing here? What am I supposed to be doing? There's no users, right? But there are always humans, right? Even though there's no end users in the typical sense, there are humans being affected by this product, maybe consuming whatever's downstream of this product. So there should be human-centered design. And with that premise, we started to develop a specialty around how do you apply HCD Agile for data projects. So there's some differences. You know, there's a greater need for HCD in discovery on data projects, and then the need kind of tends to drop off a little bit more as you get further down, because you're not doing heavy duty design, you're not creating screens. Obviously, there's usually not a visual designer on these projects. There is a huge focus on team alignment. And one of the things that's a huge byproduct of having an HCD Agile team working so closely with the client team is that these activities that we do really gets everybody aligned. So when we do story mapping, especially, and everybody is in a room for a couple of days, agreeing on the stories that are going to wind up in the backlog, it really brings alignment to the project. And I would say 90% of the time, the client realizes they were not as aligned as they thought they were until we brought them through these activities. And so that, you know, that team alignment is a huge issue. And it seems to be bigger on data projects, maybe because they're so intangible. So having these HCD type activities on data projects really brings about that necessary alignment. Journey mapping for data projects may actually reflect the journey of the data, not the person. So you can follow a piece of data through a pipeline, and that becomes the journey that we're going to enhance and that we're going to develop. And also visualizations are huge on data projects, right? Everybody wants their own dashboard and all sorts of things like that. So it's really an interesting, different little, it's kind of a sideline. And we're really, if you're interested in this, let's reach out to me later, because we have a little group that's trying to create best practices and more knowledge around this as well. So what is it that makes HCD Agile successful? If you boil it down, from an organizational perspective, 4 things: leadership, support, top down. Got to be there, because I've been in a lot of places like you have where you didn't have that and everything else was working, and they, you know, but if you don't have that leadership at the top, it's really hard to make this work. Iterative, multidisciplinary process definition, supported by informed hiring, sales, and marketing. So again, up and down the organization, everybody has to be on board. Everybody has to understand this, and maintain via cultural integration. So everything we do is human-centered, and we make sure that everybody understands this is not an option, right? This is the way we engage, and everybody's on board with that. So that's from an organizational success factor level. From a delivery level, HCD Agile is really upfront discovery, just enough, right? We got it, we're Agile, so we're moving fast. So enough discovery to build the right thing, a right-sized team, trained Agile engineers and human-centered designers. So you're not just thinking about HCD. You've got people who know how to do HCD, and they work together. They're on the same team. They're co-located. They're co-leading on the same project, and they stay that way throughout the whole project. So with that, I'd like to open up to questions, discussion, comments, and we could do this with the chat. I'm going to open that up. If anybody wants to shout out too at some point, I'll go from here. I'll just wait here. It looks like no questions yet, but if anybody wants to chime in verbally, please feel free. Alona?
Yep. I was wondering about the point system, and you were saying how you try to, well, you put them up or you put 0 or like, so the points that they're using, are those just development points, or are the, you know, UX research, UX points are, how do you estimate them? Because
so it is apples and oranges, and I'll send it to you. What the HCD points are more based, they're not Fibonacci, they're based basically on the reality of a sequence of HCD type activities. So like the smallest thing you could do in HCD tends to be sort of like an expert evaluation. And you can do that in 4 hours. Well, what's the next biggest thing you could do? Probably, you know, a 3-day, you know, design against best practices ever. So it's really reality-based chunks of time. And again, it's not counted against the development velocity. So we have a little bit more latitude, but it does help us, and it helps our AEL be able to say, okay, this is a 3-day effort. We're not gonna, you know, we're gonna wait on this. It's a 2-week effort. We're gonna push that out to the next sprint, you know, that kind of stuff. But I'll share that with you afterwards. There's a question, what are some of the examples of the co-leading activities and discussions between and led by the HCD leader and the Scrum Master? Great question. First of all, they usually sit next to each other pre-COVID. They are co-located, so they're sitting together. They're talking every day, they're talking constantly. So that is sort of the undercurrent of all of this. But as far as activities with the client, we have something called a monthly check-in with the client. We have a delivery manager as well, who goes to the client with the AEL and the HCDL, and they have a recap of the previous month. So it's always, are we on track? One of our basic deliverables is a roadmap, which is, again, a little different than pure Agile, right? This is a hybrid approach. But the reason we have a roadmap is our clients want to figure out, like, how long is this going to take? This is just reasonable. Even though they want to do Agile and they believe in Agile, they've got a timeline, they got a budget. So we're like, okay, let's understand what that is. We'll put together a roadmap, and then every month we go over that in real time with the client. We check velocity, we make sure everything's on track, we see if there's any change in the priorities and so forth. So it's a typical client meeting, but that always happens with the AEL, HCDL. And then, again, I died and went to heaven. If you go to a story mapping session, the HCDL is running the session, but the AEL and all the developers are in the session the entire time. So that early alignment is really critical. As the project goes on, you don't necessarily have to have all of the developers and all of the activities, and that initial alignment, however, is so important that those upfront activities, we want to have everybody there. But anything important like facilitation workshops, things like that, usually the AEL it attends or co-leads with the HCDL. I see a question here. What's best practice to avoid creating a Frankenstein solution, i.e. the repetitive design sprint prior to the build sprint being too features focused versus the more holistic experience? So Tony, I'm going to see if I'm getting this right. It's Agile tends to get you more into a feature mindset.
Exactly.
Than a holistic experience. So best practice, I would say, having that initial alignment again, and that story mapping, that big picture. That we have standard things that we do on every project. And I would say story mapping is the thing that avoids that Frankenstein solution, because it's not shelfware, right? We don't just do it and then move on. We're always coming back to that story map, and the story map is the big picture, and it is holistic, right? Because it shows you the spine, and it shows you all the feature details. So we do carve it up to be able to block it into sprints, but we never lose that spine. And every sprint we come back to that story map as a team and we review it, and we see if it's changed or if any of the priorities changed. So I would say that's probably the #1 thing that helps.
Thank you. Is it, and I assume the story map, it's the amount of time spent on that is relative to the size of the project overall then?
It's not a huge variation depending on the size. I mean, most of our projects tend to be lengthy. They go on for at least a year. But even smaller projects still takes a couple days to story map. It doesn't, yeah, I see what, I hear what you're saying. Some of the story mapping exercises do go on for 2 or 3 days to get the whole thing. But yeah, you could do a smaller one as well.
Thank you.
How would you implement user testing and the findings from your testing into the Agile process? Well, essentially, we're making sure that we're doing the testing prior to the development of that feature or that feature set. And again, everybody's involved, so we have a lot of our developers are attending the testing, or if they can, if they can't, they're at least getting the readout at the end. And then it just kind of, it rolls into their work. It's not as formal as an old style presentation. Everybody's sitting there together, everybody's co-located. So they're part of the process. They know what's happening during the user testing. Stations are happening. And so it's just really mostly about timing and coordination, making sure that we're doing the user testing in enough time to be useful to the developers. Can you give an example of a data project where you integrated HCD? So yeah, we actually did a project that was for a geospatial company, and they needed to move data down a pipeline. So from where it was collected in the field to where it was being used by data scientists. And that data had to go through many different steps. And when I say data, I'm talking millions and millions and millions of data points, per day. So it had to go from a bunch of disassociated collection feeds and then be integrated into a pipeline. So that's just one example. And it's, from a visual design or a usability or human-centered design standpoint, it's about as exciting as watching paint dry. But once you get to learn who the users are, and then you start interviewing the data scientists, and they're really cool people and really committed people, and you see how they can really get interested in your process, it gets a lot more fun. So the people part is definitely the fun part. How is the AEL different from a regular Scrum Master? There's probably a lot of overlap there, but they're also servant leader to the team. They're doing a lot of client contact as well. They're working closely with the HCDL, so they're a little bit more HCD savvy than possibly an Agile Scrum Master who hasn't been exposed to human-centered design. That's pretty close. And yes, data projects are exciting for an information architect. I think I got the questions from the chat. I think I've got them all. Any other questions or comments? We have about 3 minutes.
Well, if there's no more questions, maybe I'll just take the opportunity. Oh, there's a question that just came in here.
Oh. One of the stories updated by the product manager. On the product manager meaning, after the research. Stories are updated constantly. It really depends. We often play the role, and actually this goes back to the question of AEL. We often have to play the role of deputy product owner, because product owners on the client side are often just really, really busy. They're not making day-to-day decisions. So we really have our eyes on the backlog constantly. Opinion of safe. I don't know a lot about it, but it is very challenging. It's challenging from a pure development standpoint. It's more challenging from an HCD Agile standpoint. But yeah, that's a whole other hour. I could bring my Agilist colleague with me, and he could give you an earful.
Good.
Okay,
right.
Paul.
Sure. If there's no more questions, another question. You want to just take?
Yes. Do you have any
there?
ideas on how to begin institutionalizing HCD research insights so you're not starting from zero with each research sprint? So so meaning cross product? Am I understanding that correctly? Thank you, Marie. Yeah, so a lot of what I do with my team, so I have all the human-centered designers, and we meet frequently. We meet maybe 2 or 3 times a month. Again, that's pre-COVID, but we're still meeting remotely now, and we share what we're doing on our projects. So, you know, we're all deployed to different clients, different companies. So we're just doing a lot of sharing. So there's a lot of tribal kind of stuff. Research ops, yes, it is the buzzword for how to maintain this kind of knowledge, but as a consultancy, a lot of times is not a transfer from one project to another, because we're working across different domains. We're working, as I mentioned, geospatial, we do healthcare, we do fintech, all sorts of things. So it's a little trickier to have a basis of knowledge other than tribal. And remote collaboration, you're looking at it. We also use Miro. We use Miro to do story mapping, and just a lot of different kinds of things that, we're always learning new tools, experimenting with new remote tools. Of course, Zoom.
Good. Okay, maybe we'll leave it there for now. So I want to thank Carol very much for a great talk. And if, as many of you know, after the presenter, some of us stick around for a little discussion and networking. So if you'd like to do that, please stick around, and we'll create some breakout rooms so people can get to know some of our colleagues a bit better. On the other hand, if that doesn't interest you, or you need to go make dinner, then maybe now's the time to drop off. So I'll wait a minute or two to see who's still around, and we'll create some breakout rooms. Thanks a lot, Carol.
Okay, thank you all. Thank you all. It's great seeing all of you.